Psychology of Isolation, How ADX Florence Breaks Minds. Imagine a place so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat echo against concrete walls. No voices, no touch. Just you, a steel door, and 4 white walls closing in. For many prisoners at ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America, this silence doesn't bring peace. It drives them mad. But how does a prison, without laying a single hand on you, break your mind piece by piece? ADX. Florence is nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Built in 1994, it was designed for one purpose: control the most dangerous men in America. Drug lords, terrorists, gang leaders, spies. If you can't be handled anywhere else, you end up here. But the real weapon of ADX isn't its steel doors or gun towers. It's isolation. Over 400 men live here, most of them locked down alone for 23 hours a day. They eat in their cells. They exercise in small concrete cages called dog runs. Human contact? Almost zero. For some, days turn into weeks, then into years. The results? Terrifying. Court documents describe inmates cutting themselves, smearing blood on walls, screaming for hours and begging guards to talk to them. Even the toughest gangsters start to unravel. One former inmate, Jack Powers, spent years in solitary at ADX. He developed hallucinations so vivid, he mutilated himself, cutting off his own fingers and earlobes. Powers later described the experience. Isolation makes you crazy. It breaks you. His case became one of the central pieces of evidence in lawsuits against the prison. Psychologists warn that prolonged isolation causes what's called SHU syndrome, named after special housing units, the solitary wings of prisons. Symptoms include paranoia, anxiety, hallucinations, and loss of memory. Dr. Craig Haney, one of America's leading experts, has testified that ADX Florence creates conditions that push prisoners to the edge of sanity. Even the courts couldn't ignore it. In 2012, federal judge Richard Match condemned ADX for housing severely mentally ill inmates in solitary conditions. He wrote that the prison is not designed to accommodate seriously mentally ill inmates. Yet it does. Behind those walls, men who needed psychiatric care were left to rot in silence. And yet, despite lawsuits, expert testimony, and public outrage, ADX Florence still operates largely the same way today. So the question is, why does the US government keep defending a system that seems designed to destroy the human mind? Life in the box. The first thing every new inmate at ADX Florence learns is this: your world has just shrunk to the size of a 7 by 12 foot cell. That's smaller than a walk-in closet. Inside, you'll find a concrete bed with a thin mattress, a desk bolted to the wall, and a toilet sink combo. No bars, just a solid steel door with a small slot, the kind used to slide in your food. From the moment you step inside, you realize this is not a prison. It's a tomb for the living. Prisoners at ADX spend 23 hours a day locked inside. The 1 hour of freedom? It's not what you'd expect. Inmates are escorted, shackled at wrists, waist, and ankles, into a small outdoor cage called a recreation pen. These pens are so small and bare, some prisoners call them dog runs. Imagine staring up at the sky through a wire mesh, knowing that's the only piece of the outside world you'll see that day. Meals are delivered 3 times a day through the slot in the door. No cafeteria, no conversation, just trays of food, often eaten in silence, sitting on the edge of a concrete bed. One prisoner described it as eating in a coffin. For some, mealtime becomes the highlight of the day, not because of the food, but because it's the only moment when another human hand passes close. After weeks or months of this routine, the human mind begins to change. Scientists call it sensory deprivation. The brain is starved of stimulation. Without regular human contact, prisoners start talking to themselves. Some invent imaginary friends. Others pace in circles until their feet bleed, just to feel movement. One former warden admitted, "The place is designed to make you lose your grip." Take Thomas Silverstein, once called America's most dangerous prisoner. He spent 36 years in solitary confinement, many of those at ADX Florence. Locked alone, year after year, his world shrank to silence. Silverstein later wrote, "It's a slow, constant drip of mental torture." Even the guards admitted he became a ghost of a man, alive but hollow. Psychologists have recorded inmates reporting auditory hallucinations, hearing voices that aren't there. Some claim to hear guards whispering through vents. Others hear phantom footsteps or banging on the walls. But in truth, the only sound is the echo of their own minds breaking. This is daily life in the box. Isolation that cuts deeper than any blade, designed not just to punish, but to erase. But what happens when inmates fight back? When desperation turns into riots, lawsuits, and even death? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the violent consequences of a prison that thrives on silence. The silence snaps. For most men inside ADX, the silence gnaws slowly, day by day. But for some, it suddenly snaps. Guards report moments where an inmate who's been quiet for months suddenly begins screaming at the top of his lungs, banging his fists against the steel door for hours, until his knuckles split open. These aren't isolated incidents. They're a pattern, a symptom of a prison designed to push men past the limits of sanity. Court records reveal another grim truth. Suicides at ADX Florence are not rare. In 2019, convicted terrorist inmate Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, better known as Carlos the Jackal, reported how men around him were driven to self-destruction. Some hanged themselves with bedsheets tied to vents. Others cut deep into their own flesh, just to feel something real. Each time the silence of the cell was broken, not by voices, but by death. In 2012, a group of prisoners filed a class action lawsuit against ADX Florence. They argued that the prison was holding men with severe mental illness in solitary, something experts say is equivalent to torture. The case revealed shocking details: men smearing feces on themselves, swallowing razors, mutilating their bodies, and guards simply sliding meal trays through the slot, as if nothing had happened. For others, the only way to fight back is with their bodies. Hunger strikes have become a form of protest at ADX. Inmates refuse food for weeks, sometimes months, until they collapse. One inmate wrote in a smuggled letter, "They can control my body, but they can't control my hunger." But here's the truth. Most hunger strikes end the same way: force feeding, through a tube shoved down the throat. Unlike other prisons, ADX almost never sees large-scale riots, because inmates can't gather. But desperation has sparked sudden bursts of violence. In one incident, an inmate attacked a guard during a rare face-to-face movement. Another time, prisoners set small fires in their cells using smuggled contraband, filling entire ranges with smoke. Even in the world's most secure prison, rage finds its way out. ADX Florence was built to contain violence, but isolation often breeds it instead. But here's the question. What happens when the world outside these walls begins to notice? Exposed to the world. For years, ADX Florence operated in near-total secrecy. Few reporters were allowed inside, and even fewer inmates could speak freely about their experiences. But that changed in the early 2000s, when lawyers and human rights groups began to notice the growing list of suicides, mutilations, and mental breakdowns. What was once whispered inside cells was now shouted in federal courtrooms. In 2012, a landmark class action lawsuit was filed, Baycote versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. The plaintiffs argued that ADX Florence was violating the Constitution by locking mentally ill inmates in solitary cells. Court filings revealed haunting testimony: men smearing blood on the walls, begging for treatment, yet being ignored. The case shook the system, Because for the first time, the US government had to answer, is ADX Florence humane, or is it legal torture? Around the same time, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International began investigating. Their reports described ADX Florence as cruel, inhuman, and degrading. They warned that America was violating international law by subjecting mentally ill inmates to extreme isolation. Suddenly, ADX wasn't just a prison problem, it was a human rights scandal. UN discussions about solitary confinement. Shockingly, even those who ran ADX spoke out. Former wardens admitted the prison's design created psychological destruction. One ex-official said bluntly, ADX was never meant for rehabilitation. It was built to bury men alive. Coming from inside the system, this was devastating. If the wardens themselves knew ADX broke minds, what chance did the inmates have? Journalists began digging deeper. The New York Times, 60 Minutes, and the Denver Post all published exposes about the psychological horrors inside ADX. One article described an inmate who tried to gouge out his own eyes. Another told of men who barked like dogs, unable to remember their own names. The stories were shocking, but they were real, and they ignited public outrage. Under pressure, the Bureau of Prisons made promises. They claimed to increase mental health screenings, add psychiatric staff, and improve conditions. But former inmates argue these changes were mostly cosmetic. The steel doors didn't open wider. The isolation didn't shrink. ADX remained what it always was, a machine built to break minds quietly. The world had finally seen a glimpse of what ADX Florence really was. But here's the chilling truth. Even after lawsuits, headlines, and international condemnation, the prison still runs the same way today. The science of solitary. What really happens to the brain when it's locked inside a box for 23 hours a day? Neuroscientists say the damage is measurable. MRI scans of prisoners held in long-term solitary show shrinkage in parts of the brain linked to memory, decision-making, and impulse control. In simple terms, isolation doesn't just feel like it's destroying you. It literally reprograms the way your brain works. A study from Stanford University found that prisoners in solitary were more likely to experience hallucinations, panic attacks, hypersensitivity to noise, and memory loss. One inmate described forgetting how to spell his own name after years in isolation. Scientists call it psychological atrophy, the slow erosion of mental muscles until the mind simply collapses. In 2011, the United Nations declared solitary confinement beyond 15 days a form of torture. Why? Because research showed that after just 2 weeks of isolation, the brain begins to show signs of irreversible damage. At ADX Florence, many prisoners spend decades like this. Imagine what 15 years does. Or 30. Psychologists often compare ADX prisoners to children locked in dark rooms. Deprived of stimulation, the brain begins to regress. One expert said, "They're not just losing skills, they're becoming childlike. Their emotions raw, their impulses uncontrollable." In other words, solitary doesn't harden men, it unravels them. Although Khalif Browder was never at ADX, his story shows what solitary does. At age 16, Browder was sent to Rikers Island, where he spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement. When he was finally released, the trauma followed him. Browder later took his own life at age 22. His case became a national symbol of how isolation scars the mind, even long after freedom. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist who studied solitary confinement for decades, concluded that long-term isolation produces a psychiatric syndrome: confusion, paranoia, rage, and even full-blown psychosis. His warning is simple: no one leaves ADX Florence the same. So if we know isolation rewires the brain, destroys memory, and sparks madness, why does ADX Florence keep using it? All right, now we enter Chapter 6, the logic of control. This chapter explains why ADX Florence exists in this extreme form. It's where the government's rationale collides with the human cost. A chilling look at why officials defend isolation despite knowing its devastating effects. The worst of the worst. ADX. Florence was never built for ordinary prisoners. From the beginning, it was branded as the home of the worst of the worst. Terrorists, cartel leaders, gang shot callers, men who could order murders with a single word, even from behind bars. Officials argue that isolation at ADX isn't just punishment. It's protection. Protection for guards, protection for other inmates, and protection for the public. When Mexican drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was extradited to the U.S., there was only one place secure enough to hold him: ADX Florence. Known for tunneling out of prisons in Mexico, El Chapo was placed in a cell designed so carefully, escape was impossible. For the government, ADX became proof. This is the only place where men like him can be controlled. ADX also houses convicted terrorists. Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. And even members of Al-Qaeda. Officials argue that isolation stops them from radicalizing others, spreading ideology, or planning new attacks. In their eyes, solitary isn't cruelty, it's national security. But it's not just terrorists. ADX holds gang leaders like Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham of the Aryan Brotherhood, men responsible for ordering murders inside federal prisons. In the gang world, power flows through communication. ADX isolates leaders so completely that their orders can't leave the cell. It's the government's ultimate weapon against organized crime. From the government's perspective, isolation works. No escapes, no mass riots, no coordinated attacks from the inside. They call ADX Florence a clean solution. A prison so secure that it eliminates threats before they even happen. But the question is, at what cost? ADX. Florence may control bodies, but it destroys minds. And the haunting truth is this: the damage doesn't stay behind those walls. When inmates are eventually released, or even transferred, the scars of isolation spill back into society.